It began with the sound of porcelain shattering. A white mug cracked against tile, a thin spiderweb of ceramic crawling outward like frost. Steam lifted in a ghost of chamomile from the sink. A stuffed koala sat face down on the kitchen floor, one stitched eye staring at the ceiling. 7-year-old Sophie Ruiz stood for a long moment with the phone pressed to her ear, the numbers memorized, but the room tilted around her. Her small fingers trembled. She had been told again and again how to call for help. "Call Ryan," her mother had said. "Call Uncle Ryan if anything happens." Sophie had learned the rhythm, right thumb, left thumb, the little pause between exchange and ring, until it was muscle. Tonight there was a clumsy rush. Her thumb hit the wrong key, the phone clicked, a wrong digit found its mark, and a voice answered that no one in their narrow, familiar world should have been in reach. "Daman Ward," a calm, distant voice said, somewhere between the hum of an elevator and the hush of a private office. It sounded like an answer from elsewhere in the city, high glass, a late-night light burning in a room that cost more than the building Sophie knew as home. Sophie did not know Daman Ward, no one in their block did. But she knew urgency when it came down the line. Her words tumbled out. "Mom's bleeding, she fell, she's—" And then a small, decisive breath. "Please, I'm Sophie," she said. "Call Ryan." On the other end, Daman's phone lay on a lacquered table beside an untouched glass of whiskey. He had been reading a report he did not need to read, making small private calculations that had nothing to do with a 7-year-old and a chipped mug. The voice at the other end sounded like a piece of another life. Raw, unpracticed, honest. There are people for whom charity is a headline. There are people whose impulse is to act. Daman moved before his mind finished weighing the cost of another interruption. He was not a man to be in anyone's backyard by chance. He had been a presence for many things he preferred to keep separate. Tonight, the wrong digit was a misfire of fate. He told the girl he was coming. He did not say why. He just said, "Hold on, Sophie. Help is on the way." The drive across the city was a cross-section of winter. Sodium lamps smeared by rain. The glow of subway vents. Steam rising from manhole covers like sleepwalking ghosts. Daman drove with the soft focus of someone practiced at arriving where he wanted to be, and making it matter. He carried Elena in his arms when he found her, small despite the years, hair damp against the pillow, a smear of blood at the temple that woke a long-closed knot in the chest of anyone who once wore a nurse's scrubs. He carried the weight of a stranger who had been the center of a small domestic world. Sophie had curled beside her mother's legs on the floor, knees to chin, the phone still clutched in her hand, breath caught between the beginning and the end of a child's brave work. When Daman knocked and the door opened, she looked up and saw a man in a dark coat with a face that carried no pity, only an immediate, quiet competence. "You came anyway," she said later, like a verdict and a blessing all at once. They reached St. Marin's with the eerie efficiency of two people who needed nothing explained. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and waiting, and the tiny electric hiss of monitors. Nurses moved in a practiced choreography, voices low and quick. No one made promises. No one pretended to control the parts of life the machine could not. But they took Elena in as if she belonged to them, as if the air in the room had been waiting for someone to arrive and say, "We need your hands." Sophie was asked to sit in the waiting room where the world felt too large and too silent. She pressed her palm to the glass of a vending machine and watched the lights blink. A nurse came back, spoke to Daman in a way that marked him, without explanation, as a steady presence. She stabilized. Small laceration. Concussion signs are minimal. "You'll want to talk to social work about—" The nurse's voice softened where it named small continuations for a life that had hung by a thread an hour ago. That softening was the place where the first CTA could live, unobtrusive and brief. "If this is touching you," a small prompt would later ask, like the pat on the wrist of the world that there are more stories worth your time. In the quiet after, when the IVs were threadless and the monitors spoke only in the low patient language of numbers, Elena slept with the helmet of hospital blankets near her face. Daman sat in a plastic chair that complained under his weight and watched the woman's chest rise and fall. He had not asked for the file of her past, nor had he prepared to want it, but the hospital tags, An old nurse's cadence in her breathing, the set of her jaw when she woke. These things told him there was more to this small disaster than a mislaid ankle, a broken cup. When she opened her eyes, Elena's face was sheepish with the kind of shame that had little to do with the accident, and more to do with the history that sat in the room like an uninvited guest. "You didn't have to do that," she said first, carefully calibrating gratitude so it would not become obligation. He told her it was the wrong number and the right one at the same time. His voice was steady. He left out the fact that he had watched the building where she lived, half a mile away from his parking garage, once for a different reason entirely. He left out that this was the kind of deviation that would complicate his tidy life as an investor. He said only the things a man can say without asking for anything in return. "You're safe now." Elena's hands were small and knotted where worry had tried to make them smooth. She was a single mother who had learned to wear competence like armor. For a long time she had been someone else's authority, a head nurse at St. Maron's pediatrics unit, a woman who could read the subtle language of monitors and murmurs and minute shifts that meant the difference between a child's breath and the silence after, that life had been unstitched when a monitor failed, and a child named Connor died under a cloud of confusion and blame. Names had shifted, fault became error, error became negligence, negligence became scandal. Files vanished. Fingers were pointed. Elena kept the parts of that life that mattered. A brown envelope, emails printed and folded, a receipt for a delivery whose box had been stamped not with a manufacturer but with a corporate shell name. When she reached into the pocket of her coat and brought the envelope out, she did so with the clumsy defiance of someone who had clung too long to evidence, because evidence is sometimes the only thing you have left of the people you loved. She did not ask Daman to read it. She laid it on the tray between them like an offering, like a dare. He looked at the envelope the way some people look at the small map of a life. Uneven edges, careful handwriting, the smell of hospital paper pressed into cardboard. He did not pry. He let the weight of it settle into his palms. Inside were notes in Elena's cramped nurse script, dates, times, a delivery confirmation for monitors that had been deployed in Connor's room, an email thread with a name signed A. Kalin, the CFO title attached like a business card, and a photograph of a monitor screen that had gone dark in the middle of the night. There were other things, a ledger printout with odd transfers, a phone number that matched no one she wanted to call. Daman was not a man who treated documents lightly. He understood the texture of leverage in ink. He felt, in a part of himself, that had been trained to see patterns in balance sheets, the shape of something that could not be right. "Why did you keep this?" he asked, more to understand the pull than to interrogate. "Because no one would listen," Elena said. Her voice was a creak on a hinge. "They said it was a faulty cable. They said the monitor was obsolete. They closed the file and closed my name, Connor." She stopped. The room filled with the spaces she left. Sophie came back to the lobby when Elena woke. She held a small paper cup of juice like a peace offering. She had been given stickers by a nurse, and she pressed them into Daman's hand with the solemnity with which children hand over the small tokens of their world. "Thank you for coming," she told him. The phrase was simple. It had the weight of a covenant. Daman left the hospital with the brown envelope in his coat and a small intimate knowledge. The life it contained had been wronged. He did not know yet where it would lead him. He only knew that in the quiet hum of his car, an outline had appeared on his night. He drove home with the radiator in his building knocking softly against the cold, and the envelope on the passenger seat like a secret the city had handed him. That night in his office he opened a laptop and let the glow sketch his face in blue. He called Jonas, who had handled audits and tracing for the ward's quieter affairs for years. Jonas answered in a voice that made a profession of being awake at odd hours. "You never call before 10, Jonas said. "Consider this an exception," Daman said. He did not explain the envelope, only hinted at it. "I need you to look at payments, small amounts. Cut through the fog. If you find a trail, follow it until it stops being comfortable." Jonas made running noises with his mouth, an approval that meant in their shorthand, "I'm already halfway there." "Where do you want me to start?" he asked. Daman told him a name. Andrew Kalin, CFO. St. Maron's procurement ledger. Look for transfers to shell companies registered within the past 5 years. Pay attention to delivery receipts that don't match vendor accounts. It was specific, but not surgical. The kind of instruction that divided the plausible from the paranoiac. Jonas acknowledged the line. I'll pull what I can. Advice. Be careful who knows you want this. People move fast when their margins are threatened. Damen turned the brown envelope over in his hands as the city contracted outside his window. He thought of the 7-year-old who'd hit a wrong digit, and of the woman who had once stood where so many parents had to stand. At the edge of a child's breath, counting seconds, making choices that would not let go of them. He thought of Connor, a name on a small square of paper that felt suddenly heavy, and of the way institutions could smooth a problem by making the person who noticed it into the problem instead. He did not call Elena to offer a plan. He sat with the fact of the envelope like someone who had been given custody of a secret. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement. He had been given a thread, and he intended to pull. The next day, small things began to shift the air. An assistant he never spoke to directly forwarded a vendor list with no comment. A late-morning email arrived in Damen's inbox with an attached photograph, a monitor on a delivery dock, a manufacturer's label visible in the corner, and a sticker in a font not associated with the brand. It was a small thing, almost easily dismissible. The label had been doctored. A phone number in Elena's notes led to a shell company registered to a mailbox in a business park, miles away from any actual manufacturer. Names in the shipping logs repeated like a chorus. Same addresses, different company names. For Elena, going back into a system that had once discarded her felt like stepping into a room whose windows were all locked. She had learned to live in the margins, to make a life that kept her daughter fed and warm without leaning on the hospital she once loved. The envelope had been her private altar, evidence she had kept more for herself than for anyone else. She wanted what any mother wants after a scrape, or a fear, a promise of, at the very least, safety for her child. She did not want to be the person who reopened wounds that might never stop bleeding, but the presence of Damen, steady, not performative, offering help without headlines, created a new geometry. He asked questions that were not calculating for his own benefit. He asked them as someone realizing that power could be used to protect rather than to profit. He did not demand to be her savior. He offered a partnership. Help me understand what you have. Tell me what you want from this. Elena surprised herself by answering. I don't want to go back to the hospital as an employee, she said. I don't want to be stitched back into a life that punished me. I only want the parts that matter. Safety for Sophie. Nothing more than that. But I will not let another parent lose their child because a ledger looks cleaner. Her terms were precise. She would act as an independent advisor, not as an employee. She would not hand the envelope over to anyone without first knowing where it would land. She wanted the freedom to speak on her own terms. That was the first place she reclaimed agency, folding it into the envelope like an invisible shield. Damen listened to the terms as if they were currency. He agreed without grand declarations. We do it your way, he said. You tell me where to look, and I'll make sure the people who can actually move things, quietly, start to look too. When he called Jonas again, it was not with the sanitized language of corporate crisis. It was with the urgency of a man who had found a child calling into a world that had not expected to have to answer. Start with procurement, he said. Look at delivery receipts tied to monitors. See if any payments have names that don't match the suppliers. If you see anything, Jonas cut in once, practiced and succinct. I'll need access to St. Maron's vendor portal. Anonymous access, if possible. And some of those shell addresses. I'll want to see the chain of custody. The request hung between them as an incision into the ordinary hum of the city's institutions. It was the kind of thing that could be done quietly, but it could also make a man very visible. Damen did not flinch. There was a line on a ledger somewhere where the cost of doing nothing had been funeral arrangements and quiet, unbearable grief. That line gave him the kind of clarity most fortunes do not buy. In the days that followed, evidence arrived in small domestic increments that made the city's large machinery look fragile. Elena found an old delivery receipt folded into a box of a furnace filter. a scrap that had been useful for nothing but keeping a conscience from going silent. She handed it to Daman as if she were passing a relic. He examined it in his apartment kitchen under the yellow lamp, and could point to discrepancies that a layperson would not have noticed. An invoice number out of sequence, a vendor listed that, when cross-referenced, had no digital footprint beyond the single invoice. Jonas, from a dim office, began to pull threads. He traced payments that zigzagged through accounts before finding their way to a procurement manager's private firm. He ran numbers that linked small, discrete donations to larger Coyer entries labeled equipment maintenance, and found that the sums assigned to supposed service contracts ballooned at the same time new monitors had been purchased. Charles Whitmore, a seasoned board member and something of an institutional barometer, was the first man in a suit who smelled the shift and decided he preferred caution. Daman arranged a meeting that read, on paper, like a whisper, a discussion about vendor oversight. Charles arrived with the easy reserve of someone whose default appointment with crisis was a calendar entry labeled discretion. He did not want scandal. He wanted the hospital to keep functioning where it mattered, and to keep the donors from fainting. In a narrow conference room, paper cups of coffee went cold as Daman laid out the facts like a careful map. He did not accuse, he presented anomalies. He showed a photograph of a delivery label, then an email thread with a name that matched Elena's envelope. He watched Whitmore's face, lined and patient, sleepwalk into the register of worry and calculation. "This is a serious matter," Whitmore said at last, the words slick with institutional weight. "If there is a discrepancy in procurement, the board should form a committee. We need an internal audit." "Quiet," Daman interrupted softly. "If this goes public before it's understood, people will be punished without the possibility of remedy. If there is fraud, those responsible will burn the trail and the victims will be exposed." Charles finished for him. He was not unkind. He was simply the personification of the temptation to do nothing visible. "We protect the hospital's reputation unless there's an obvious legal imperative. We do not leak rumors." Daman met his gaze. "I am not asking for a headline. I'm asking you to allow a discreet audit. Suspensions if required. Do not let this hide in a drawer." The room filled with a peculiar silence, like the air before a piano key is struck hard. These were the private vicissitudes of institutions, decisions cushioned by polite language but capable, in their consequences, of altering several lives at once. Elena sat in the back of that meeting, an invisible presence who had published nothing but had offered everything. She watched the men speak about reputational risk, and felt, with a nurse's unerring instinct, the way language can become a bandage that keeps a wound from being seen. She thought of Connor's mother, and of the way small misalignments in care had become a life-ending geometry. For once she let herself imagine not retreating, but stepping forward to rectify, on her terms, the injustice that had carved her out of the life she loved. To do that, she knew she would have to show the face of her hurt to people who preferred not to look. She would have to entrust the brown envelope to hands that could make it do something other than gather dust. She would have to keep her child safe while disagreeing, vocally, with how a hospital decided which truths were inconvenient. Daman understood the lines of power. He also understood the limits of single-handed interventions. He began to bring the matter to the people who could enforce consequence without spectacle. Discreet legal counsel, an internal audit team quietly briefed to look for anomalies, and Jonas, who traced the money and found a chain that deviated into shell entities repeatedly named after defunct local storefronts. At dusk, Jonas called back with the sort of technical smile in his voice that signals discovery. "There's a funnel," he said. "Small transfers, then consolidated into a single account that routes through a holding firm. It's the kind of structure you'd see when someone wants to hide systemic payments but keep them on the books." "Can you trace the endpoint?" Daman asked. "Not fully yet," Jonas replied. "But the path cuts into a company with a P.O. box in a business complex. The signatures on the original invoices look—" He hesitated, then continued. "Forged. They're consistent with a handful of other documents I've seen in other corporate slights." Daman felt the map shift. It was not only procurement anymore, it was a pattern. a deliberate reshaping of paperwork to make bad hardware look like a random accident. A cost assigned to maintenance that was actually a payment to an intermediary that had no manufacturing ties. A child's life on the ledger appearing as a line item to be rationalized by equations. When he hung up, the apartment felt oddly domestic. Cookbooks lined the counter. A kettle that never quite steamed. He placed the brown envelope, opened now, in front of him, like a problem laid bare. The city outside the glass windows continued indifferent. Lights in buildings on, phones buzzing, the small human business of survival. But inside, a chain had been discovered. It began with a wrong call and had threaded its way into the city's arteries. Damen slept fitfully. Elena, in her small apartment, lay awake with Sophie curled against her side. The weight of possibility felt like both danger and relief. Sophie had asked more questions than a child her age had the right to. She had learned that calls may land in unexpected hands, but that some hands will answer when it matters. She had learned that a single misdial could set many things in motion. The mobilization of strangers, the reawakening of old grief, the possibility of justice. The brown envelope had become a hinge. Whoever moved it next would change the balance for good or ill. And somewhere in the city's administrative guts, a trail of numbers began to glow like breadcrumbed steps, revealing not only the shadow of negligence, but also the shape of the people who would be forced, finally, to choose between self-preservation and truth. It was one small, wrong call that had started the noise. It was another person's choice to respond that made the noise matter. At dawn, as the city smoothed itself into the orderly hum of commuters and deliveries, Damen took his coat, folded the envelope into a secure folder, and left a message for Elena that was equal parts promise and uncertainty. "I can't promise you outcomes," he said when they met in the hospital lobby that morning. Voices low amid the sterile smell of new coffee and antiseptic. "I can promise I will look, and I will not let this disappear into someone's filing cabinet." Elena studied him. There was gratitude, yes, but there was also a careful skepticism that had been honed from having trusted once and paid dearly. "I don't want to go back to that life," she said. "If this becomes about headlines or people looking for a hero, I'm out." "This won't be about heroics," Damen said. "It will be about removing dangerous devices and correcting a ledger. That's where we start." Sophie, who overheard the exchange while clutching a hospital sticker to her chest, slid a hand into Elena's and did what children do best. She believed in the possibility of a small domestic repair. "You can stay," she said plainly, as if sealing a bargain. "We can make pancakes." There was a laugh from Elena, small and surprised, like a crack in the armor. The offer of pancakes was precise and homely. It was the kind of thing that stitches up a life better than any press release. Damen left then, with more than the brown envelope. He carried the outline of a case that was both lumbering and subtle. Forged signatures, redirected funds, a chain of procurement designed to obscure the truth about devices that mattered to small, fragile people. He also carried a responsibility he had not anticipated when Sophie's wrong digit lit up his nights. There was an ethical line that separated silent philanthropy, anonymity check writing, from active risky exposure of institutional flaw. He decided then that the right answer would be riskier. In the days that followed, the work began to unfurl in small procedural ways that felt momentous to the people who had been wronged. Jonas dug deeper and found a set of invoices that bore the same tell, a tiny typographical quirk repeated across documents, the same blot on the EA that suggested they were from one hand. A delivery receipt showed a truck leaving a warehouse with a manifest that did not match the items listed in procurement. A contract bore the signature of an executive whose email address, when tested, rerouted through a private server. These were the building blocks of exposure, but they were not yet an explosion. They were the single bricks that, when arranged, would make a wall impossible to ignore. Each discovery was a small, careful cut. A signature verified here, a payment traced there. The hospital's board was notified in the quietest language possible. Charles Whitmore, sensing the wind change in the way a seasoned captain smells weather, began to advocate for a discreet internal suspension of any staff whose names recurred in dubious transfers, if the paperwork held up. At home, Elena made pancakes with Sophie. The ritual was small, almost ritualistic. She taught Sophie how to flip a pancake without crashing it like a ship against the skillet. There was laughter and a syrup smell that felt curiously like reclamation. It was a domestic altar to a life that had nearly been consumed by bigger things. It felt, in its smallness, revolutionary. That afternoon, a message arrived on Damon's phone. Jonas had moved beyond the obvious. "There's an intermediary company," Jonas said. "Its registration is recent. The signatures match a font we've flagged. The payments route through a trust. If we push on this, we will make people uncomfortable. You sure you want to keep going?" Damon looked at the text of the message without answering immediately. He thought of Sophie and the wrong call that had rung his night, and then thought again of how often decisions are small before they become large. He tapped his response. "Do what you need. Quietly. No leaks." Jonas answered with a simple emoji, the kind that meant acknowledgement without promise. There was tension in the quiet that followed. The city kept moving. Small human things, buskers playing out of tune, a vendor selling warm bread, a child with mismatched socks, continued. But an institutional mechanism, the kind that files its own sins under neat headings, felt the tug of scrutiny. A few people who had preferred the comfort of a hidden ledger woke to a night that would become inconvenient. At the center of it all, Sophie tied an apron around Elena and wore a paper hospital tag like a badge. She performed bravery with the earnestness of a child who believes the world responds to effort. She had hit the wrong key and yet, through a crooked route, had assembled a small cohort of people who would, for the first time in a long while, not let a ledger define a child's life. If this was the start, if one wrong call could begin to unspool decisions made in boardrooms and warehouses, then what followed could be larger than anyone had expected. The voice on the other end of a misdial had chosen, without ceremony, to be a participant. That choice, small and singular, would be the hinge on which several lives would come to turn. Damon began to map the risk. Elena quietly collected more documentation, ringing up old colleagues under the pretense of closure and asking questions that were politely deflective. Jonas's late-night findings suggested a path. Charles pressed for discretion. Andrew Kalin's name, appearing in innocuous corporate threads, hummed like a bad note under a melody that otherwise sounded composed. And somewhere in a small apartment where a child slept with a stuffed koala tucked against her cheek, a wrong number had already changed the geometry of several lives. The city had given a man a reason to act. A woman had been given a reason to step forward. A child had learned that courage could be as simple as a trembling thumb finding a place to press. The envelope, now partly empty of the physical evidence but full of intent, sat in Damon's briefcase like a small, dangerous relic. He had no illusions about how difficult it would be to move the machinery that hid its errors behind spreadsheets and friendly smiles. But he had also learned, in the oddest of ways, that decisions are sometimes less about grand heroics and more about small, stubborn continuations. Answering a phone, driving through rain, bringing pancakes to a kitchen that felt suddenly safer. When Jonas called again late that night, the gravity in his voice was no longer the speculative hush of a search. "I found rooting," he said. "Not perfect, but enough to raise an eyebrow. There are backers who will try to bury it. If we push, they'll push back. Be ready." Damon placed his hand over the brown envelope in the folder and, for a moment, considered the smallest of truths. That a wrong call can be accidental, but the response to it is a choice. He thought of Sophie's small thumb and the way the misdial fell like a pebble in a still pond, rings widening, catching debris that had been smoothed flat for a long time. He thought of Elena, who had been hiding evidence like a talisman, fearful and brave in equal measure. On the line, Jonas's voice suggested the next step. Quiet subpoenas, an internal freeze of certain accounts, a discreet suspension if the pattern held. Damon did not accept every proposition. He moved carefully, the way one does when fragile lives are at stake, and when institutions can crush people with a sheet of bureaucracy. The movement that began with a wrong call had not yet become a public spectacle. It hovered, charged and private, like the first light of dawn before the city fully wakes. It would soon require more of them all, not just the courage to expose, but the patience to do so without making victims of the very people they intended to protect. Daman closed his laptop, folded the folder, and left the envelope on the kitchen table like a promise. He did not know the end of the story. He only knew that for the first time in a long while, a wrong number had been answered by someone willing to bear witness. The question that now hovered between the three of them was simple and enormous. How far would they go to make sure the scales tilted back toward the people who mattered? Outside, the city breathed on. Inside, a small household reheated pancakes and pretended, for the time being, that breakfast was simple. The envelope waited, the trace evidence of a child's courage and a woman's careful keeping. The next move belonged to the people who had power enough to pull threads. For now, the fragile thing, trust, was being rebuilt one small action at a time. Dawn threaded itself through the blinds like a measured promise. The city, busy and indifferent, did not know the ledger had been pried open. For most of its skin, nothing had changed. Inside Daman's apartment, though, the world felt slit by possibility. The envelope had a new crease where he had refolded it in thought. Jonas had left a series of terse messages, each one a small comet of data. And somewhere between them and the kettle on the stove, a plan was being stitched together that would demand caution as much as courage. If this moment is touching you, pause and share it with someone who believes small acts can tilt a system. Daman walked into a room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper dust. Jonas was already there, phone on the table, a scatter of printouts like geology, layers you could read if you knew how to look. He pointed to a line on a ledger with the blunt finger of someone who had spent too many nights following tracks. "See this?" Jonas said. 3 invoices from different vendors, same formatting mistake, same billing contact, and these transfers, small on their face but they route through an entity that only exists on paper. Then they consolidate. Daman studied the printouts. In quiet, efficient sentences, he asked the questions that moved facts from suspicion into territory worth action. Jonas answered them with the shorthand of someone who could make numbers confess. It was not dramatic. It was, by degrees, devastating. A meeting with Charles Whitmore followed that afternoon. Whitmore arrived with the measured gait of a man whose life had been made by soft calibrations, political appointments, donor relationships, the small mercies of discretion. Daman placed the envelope on the table between them like a modest admissions test. He did not dramatize anything. He let the paper speak. Charles read the invoices in silence. He folded his hands, looked at Daman, then looked at Jonas. "We cannot simply sweep this under," he said finally. "But we also cannot destroy the hospital trying to fix it." "Quiet audit," Daman said. "Isolate the procurement ledger. Freeze any suspicious accounts. If necessary, remove equipment from active wards by protocol, not spectacle. If we move slowly and precisely, we reduce harm." Whitmore's mouth tightened into a line he used when weighing reputations. "And the people implicated?" "Suspension pending investigation," Jonas said before Daman could answer. It was the only phrase that kept the machinery moving while keeping accusations from becoming headlines. The board's caution smelled like a cage. For Elena, whose life had been broken by the hospital's caution, it felt like a test. Would the institution that had once taken her for the sake of its balance sheets now protect the people who mattered? She watched the men speak with a nurse's clarity about what would happen if the wrong note made it into the press. She imagined Connor's little face in the margin of every memo. She imagined how many quiet tragedies might be hidden behind maintenance entries. She had her own rules. She would not be the woman dragged back into staff meetings to be made into a cautionary tale. She would not let her name be weaponized by the very people who had once pushed it into the mud. Yet she felt the old nurse's knot, an instinct to prevent harm when she could, and it tugged at her until she could no longer keep it out of the conversation. "You're not asking me to go back," she said one evening when Daman sat across from her at the small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug as if it were a fragile argument. The kitchen light made little islands of gold against the counter. Sophie, asleep down the hall, breathed in the steady rhythm the family had learned to trust. "No," Daman said. "I asked you to be who you are on your terms. Consultant, witness, independent advisor. You tell me when you want to be visible and when you don't." She looked at him like someone examining the edges of a new map. "I don't know how to be a witness and not be broken by it." "Neither did anyone," he replied, "but you won't be alone." And so they moved. Quiet legal counsel was retained under a name that did not call attention. An internal audit team was briefed in a room that smelled of lemon disinfectant and the rust of files. Jonas worked through servers and P.O. boxes like a man unweaving a sweater to find the single loose thread. Each little discovery made the target more concrete. A shell company whose supposed products matched nothing in warehouse manifests. A procurement manager whose signatures reappeared in ways that suggested authorship by another hand. A trust account that smoothed payments into something less legible. The first real shock came when a compliance officer in procurement surfaced the simplest of documents. A delivery manifest that, on its face, was routine. But when cross-checked with an independent manufacturer's serial numbers, the monitors listed there did not align. Serial numbers belonged to a model discontinued 2 years prior. The units in service were newer, with different specifications. How, the team asked, had the procurement ledger reconciled different hardware to cost centers as if they were the same? Those are the moments when systems fray. They are never theatrical. They are a row of dominoes that fall because someone somewhere decided to type a name differently, to round a number down a fraction of a percent, to call an account maintenance rather than replacement. The sum of those tiny choices accumulates until it becomes a policy issue, then a scandal, then a grief that must be accounted for. Dahman, nevertheless, was careful. He did not want the hospital on the defensive because of him. He wanted the hospital to answer incompetence. He pressed only for measures that would slow down those who might hide things and speed up those who could provide truth. He asked for removal of the suspect monitors from active pediatric beds, not because a headline demanded it, but because if some piece of equipment was behaving unreliably, children's lives should not be the variable. The day the procurement manager, an efficient man named Mark Lyle, was quietly placed on leave pending inquiry, Elena felt the first brittle taste of vindication. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like the world inhaling after holding its breath too long. Mark left with a cardboard box and the pretense of privacy. The sign on his office door went from procurement to temporarily unavailable. The devices in question were moved to a storage room with locked access and a paper chain of custody that made it clear this was a matter now treated as evidence. There was a consequential, quieter action that followed. A call from a compliance counsel saying the CFO, Andrew Kalin, was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His title, CFO, hung in the room like a rank that implied control. The accusation of mismanagement implied motive and method. The hospital fiercely guarded its public face. The move was described to Elena as protective. To her, it looked like the ledger had finally found a hand no longer willing to hide behind policy. There were private moments that didn't make headlines and, perhaps, never would. Elena and Dahman met in the hospital cafeteria at an off hour, trading silences and the kind of small confessions that stitch people together. He brought tea. She brought a folded photocopy of an email she had never sent. They read the lines aloud, the italicized wording of a vendor's alleged representative offering to streamline costs. And each line read like betrayal. "You could have made this disappear," she said once, more to the tray than to him. The words were not accusation so much as inventory. "I could have," he said. "But then what would change? Who benefits from the quiet?" She considered that. "Some people," she said slowly, "are paid to keep things quiet. But the quiet is what killed Connor." They both knew the word would land differently with different people in the room. For Elena, Connor's death was not an abstract tally. It was a child whose breath had been an urgent language she had been trained to translate. A child who had required vigilance that, for reasons traced back to an invoice line and a missing cable, had not been there. The hospital's response was surgical, and for once oriented toward the people who mattered. The suspicious monitors were cataloged and held. An external review of procurement policy was initiated. Donors were repurposed to fund a comprehensive equipment audit. There was no headline that cried conspiracy. Instead, there were memos, OR memos, and a list of units temporarily reassigned to other wards until their hardware could be confirmed safe. Elena watched all of this with the wary gratitude of someone who had spent years being discounted. When the devices were pulled from the wards, a tedious, careful process, she stood in the corridor and watched the crates being wheeled away. The hospital staff avoided a public parade. Even the removal was done with the kind of privacy that both shielded patients and kept the story from being exploited. That discretion suited her. She had never wanted spectacle. She wanted the children within those rooms to be safe. But the ledger had to be met by accountability that could stand up to scrutiny. The pattern Jonas had traced, payments funneled via a trust and laundered into a private intermediary, was flagged to compliance. The signatures that had been forged were compared by a handwriting expert retained quietly on Damon's counsel. The forgeries matched in inconvenient ways. A name, Andrew Kalin, began to appear less like an isolated node and more like a hinge connecting procurement to expediency. When Elena finally agreed to make a statement to the internal committee, she chose her words as if they were armor. She read from the brown envelope, dates, times, delivery receipts. She described not in melodrama but in clear, nurse-sure detail how a monitor's failure could look like fault to the person watching and system to the person in a meeting. She did not call names with flourish. She let the documents do the work. There is a peculiar bravery in being methodical. Elena could have sought vengeance. She could have delighted in seeing managers lose status or donors squirm. She did not. She sought instead the ruthlessness of precision. Show the mismatch between procurement and product. Show the payments that led nowhere. Show the signatures that belonged to someone else's hand. The committee listened. They stepped back and let their instruments, auditors, counsel, compliance, do their work. At one point when she left the committee room, Elena saw a woman in the corridor with a bouquet of cheap supermarket daisies. The woman sat, and for a long while did not look up from the pamphlet she held about pediatric care support groups. Elena, for reasons she could not fully name, sat beside her. The two women did not introduce themselves. They did not have to. They had mouths that knew grief, and they had the kind of quiet solidarity that arises when two people recognize the long aftermath of loss. The woman looked up at Elena as if she recognized something in her face. "I came here for Connor," she said simply. "I didn't know if anyone would listen." Elena felt something like a rope loosen inside her chest. She sat with the woman and they spoke, not with the brittle currency of accusation, but with the small, necessary work of remembrance. It was not closure. It was, perhaps, the first honest exchange of a life that had been denied an honest accounting. Back in the office, the administrative leave of Andrew Kalin was, by design, a matter of public record, phrased in legalese that said little and implied much. The hospital issued a short statement that framed the actions as prudent and protective. The news cycle, hungry for spectacle elsewhere, did not explode. The board's discretion and the timing of the removals prevented a public feeding frenzy. That was not because the case lacked gravity. It was because the carefully placed internal levers gave the hospital room to act without the added cruelty of public trial. There were consequences, albeit quiet ones, an internal guilt that made some people decline to offer statements. Some senior staff who had been cautious now felt the ethical wind shift under their shoes. Others who had been complicit in small denials found their excuses harder to hold on to. Through all of this, Damon remained a presence that refused to be theatrical. He did not demand credit, and he declined interviews. He was there in the small ways that mattered, collecting Sophie from school for an unexpected pancake practice, carrying a bundle of laundry because Elena had 2 nights of paperwork to file, standing a respectful distance away while Elena met with families who wanted to ask questions they had been too afraid to ask. When the hospital completed its discreet audit, the conclusion it reached was sober. Procurement irregularities indicated a pattern of misdirection. Certain devices had not been purchased directly from manufacturers. Signatures bore signs of forgery consistent with a narrow set of documents. The report recommended further legal review and proposed internal reforms. It stopped short of public indictment, because the hospital's jurisdiction did not equate to the city's. and it left the possibility of criminal inquiry to outside authorities if they deemed it warranted. For Elena, the most important practical victory was the removal of the suspect monitors from pediatric beds and the implementation of a transparent chain of custody going forward. That change, small in appearance, would alter the conditions in which children like Connor were cared for. It would not bring Connor back. It would not erase the nights she'd spent replaying step after step. But it would, in the language of the nurse she was, make future hours safer. There were quiet human shifts in the aftermath, too. Some colleagues who had once kept their distance now offered small apologies. Others, embarrassed, stayed away. Elena declined a ceremonial reinstatement. She was not interested in a public performance of reconciliation. She wanted to keep the margin that allowed her to be a mother, to hold Sophie, and to decide how to use the authority she had reclaimed. Instead of returning to a hospital desk, she chose to pilot a community-based initiative aimed at transparency in pediatric procurement, a small project that would advise clinics, speak at forums, and help parents understand what a legitimate piece of equipment should look like. She would be an advisor, not an employee tethered to a single institution. It was modest, deliberate, a way to translate pain into practice without handing over her life to the very bureaucracy that had once let her fall. The final administrative act that truly altered the tone came quietly. A letter arrived on hospital letterhead, confirming that certain practices would be changed, that procurement would be restructured, that training would be instituted to prevent the kind of paperwork slights that had contributed to Connor's death. The letter was not a triumphal proclamation. It was a formal, pragmatic document, signed by the interim compliance officer and the board chair. It read like a contract. It promised process. It promised oversight. At home, life resumed the stubborn ordinariness of small rituals. Pancakes became a Wednesday practice. Sophie insisted on flipping one each time and regarded it with the solemnity of a ceremony. Damon took a seat that used to be a single chair in the living room and gradually spent more evenings there, his presence a folded-in warmth, rather than a dramatic rescue scene. There was no sudden romance, no montage that suggested easy transitions. There were pauses, brisk conversations about boundaries, moments of mutual respect, and a slow accruing of trust. One afternoon, while Sophie painted a squeaky toy with glitter, Elena and Damon stood at the sink and washed ladles together. The steam rose in a humble domestic cathedral. Their hands met briefly over the pot, an accidental brush, a timing so ordinary it felt somehow significant. Elena did not smile in the way that betrays a person taken unawares. Instead, she returned his gesture with the quiet of someone who recognizes a companion rather than a savior. "It could have gone another way," Damon said softly, his voice shaped like admission rather than boast. "It could have," Elena agreed. "It would have been silent then. People would have kept their silence. And you would have lived with the silence," he said. She looked at him then, not as a woman rescued, but as a woman who had chosen the terms of her engagement. "I don't need saving," she said. "I needed someone to answer the phone and not hand me a postcard. I needed someone to help unpick the ledger." He laughed, a small sound that made the dishwater ripple. "I can live with those terms." That night, as Sophie slept with the stuffed koala tucked under her arm, Elena and Damon sat at the small table and made plans that were careful and practical. She would run community sessions on equipment verification. He would fund a small nonprofit that provided pro bono procurement audits to underfunded clinics. They spoke of boundaries. There would be no sudden marriage declarations, no renaming of rooms after benefactors. There would be shared pancakes, shared worry, shared decisions. They were companions aligned by a common ethic, not a scripted rescue narrative. There were small tests of the new arrangement. A donor asked Damon for an interview about his heroic act. He declined. A member of the press smelled a story and was offered an official statement that emphasized institutional reform rather than scandal. Elena was careful with her words. She spoke about safety, about system change, about the memory of those who had suffered. She refused to let grief be leveraged for spectacle. Months passed with the rhythm of slow repair. The procurement reforms held in the initial months, new checks, more transparent vendor processes, mandatory serial number verifications. A training program born from Elena's community initiative started to gather a small following of nurses who wanted the skills to protect their units from paperwork that could hide harm. Some of them had been there the day Connor died. Others had arrived after. The program emphasized vigilance, the dignity of careful record-keeping, and the idea that when small things are done with integrity, they prevent tragedies. One afternoon, Elena received a slim envelope containing a letter from a woman with handwriting like a child's, rounded, careful. Inside was a single line. "Thank you for making the room safer for my son." The letter was unsigned. Elena read it at the sink, the dish in her hand sliding into the water with a small clink. She pressed the paper to her chest as if it were a small talisman. It was a reminder that the work had a human echo. There were no grand legal sentences printed in the papers they kept. People who had been implicated were not paraded on front pages. Some of the culprits stayed unprosecuted in any public sense. Others faced workplace consequence. The story had been contained by a net of internal reforms and quiet disclosures. That, too, was a decision. An ethical calculus about how best to protect future patients while avoiding the additional harm a public spectacle might cause to those already grieving. Sophie, who had once jabbed a wrong number with the trembling thumb of a child alone in a kitchen, now sat at a tiny table teaching a neighbor's boy how to flip a pancake without fear. She counted aloud. 1, 2, 3, flip, and then laughed when the pancake stuck to the pan and came away in an abstract shape. There was no heroic moment attached to her laughter, no prize, just the domestic miracle of a life steadying. On a quiet evening, when the rain began to knit itself into the gutters and the city hummed like a soft engine, Daman took Elena's hand as they walked the block to the corner bakery. The world smelled of yeast and possibility. They bought a small lemon tart and shared it on a bench under a street lamp. No vows were exchanged. They did not promise forever. They promised instead to continue making small, deliberate choices. Choices that prioritized safety and integrity over headlines and flatteries. As they sat Sophie beside them, stirring a paper cup of hot cocoa with a plastic spoon, Elena thought of the day the mug had shattered. She thought of the small thumb that had misdialed, of the man who had answered, of the envelope that had sat like a secret in a briefcase. She thought of how fragile things are: trust, health, the thin membrane that separates calm from catastrophe, and how tenaciously one must guard them. One wrong call had set a chain in motion. It had revealed not only a system willing to obscure its own errors, but also the people who would choose to unmake that obscuration. It had shown that a child's misdial could become a hinge for accountability, and, quietly, for human connection. The finishing gestures were modest. Elena kept her advisory role. The hospital adopted the procurement reforms into policy and into practice. A small plaque in the procurement office read, "For a culture of transparency." A dry line that made Elena smile a little when she walked past it. Daman kept paying for Jonas's extra hours and, occasionally, for Sophie's pancake flour. The household owned its little rituals and its ethics. At night, when the city breathed and the lights of neighboring buildings watched like patient stars, Sophie would sometimes wake and pad into the kitchen. If Elena was there, she would pour her a cup of chamomile and press a sticker into her palm. If Daman was there, he would listen while Sophie insisted on retelling the story of the wrong number, each time with a flourish that made the retelling livelier than the last. They never made the misdial the center of their identity. They made it the hinge, an ordinary moment that had become extraordinary by the response it evoked. There are endings that try to tidy a life into a single neat sentence. This one resists tidy. The devices were removed from pediatric wards, procurement practices were reformed, and the ledger no longer hid certain entries behind polite language. Those were practical wins. But the deeper change, the restoration of Elena's agency, the modest partnership she formed with Daman, the way Sophie learned that courage could be a small, persistent thing, was quieter, more human. On a morning when the sun came up without announcement, Sophie set the table for pancakes. 2 spoons lay on the counter, slightly bent, evidence of use. Elena flipped a pancake with a practiced wrist. Damen poured coffee. The house smelled of syrup and lemon. Sophie hummed as she arranged little paper flags on the table. It was not a cinematic declaration. It was a domestic promise. She looked at Damen and then at Elena and said simply, "We're a team now." Elena caught Damen's eyes, and for a long, soft moment they both acknowledged the gravity of that unadorned claim. Teams keep one another honest. Teams feed one another when tired. Teams answer phones when courage is required. It had begun with a wrong call. It had become, through a series of careful responses, a change that mattered. That was the small wonder of it. The world can be altered by accidents, but it is the choice to answer them that determines whether the change keeps someone safe. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more stories that remind us how small acts can change everything.